The elevator doors were already sliding shut when a sudden, urgent voice cut through the hum of the marble lobby. "Wait!" Heads whipped around in unison. Security guards froze mid-step, and the receptionist half rose from her chair in sheer disbelief. Sprinting across the polished floor in a pair of high-end heels was none other than Margaret Lawson, the formidable CEO of one of the city's largest construction empires, having completely abandoned an ongoing board meeting just to catch a glimpse of someone. Out on the street, standing just past the revolving glass doors, a tired single father paused. Daniel Brooks turned slowly back toward the entrance, his expression a mix of confusion and lingering exhaustion. His formal job interview had wrapped up barely 3 minutes ago, and he had already mentally accepted the rejection. So why on earth was the CEO herself chasing after him? He tightened his grip on the worn, frayed straps of the backpack slung over one shoulder, his heart a heavy, sinking weight in his chest. That morning, before heading out the door, his 7-year-old daughter Emma had secretly slipped a tiny, clumsily folded note inside his bag. "Good luck, Daddy. I know you'll make it." He hadn't dared to open it until he was riding the elevator up to the interview. Now, that scrap of paper felt heavier and far more precious than any heavy textbook or tool he had ever carried. Years ago, Daniel had poured his heart into owning a modest neighborhood carpentry shop. For a solid decade and a half, he had poured his soul into repairing broken porches, crafting custom kitchen cabinets by hand, and delicately restoring antique furniture that everyone else had given up on. Then, the housing market took a brutal downturn, and orders simply dried up overnight. Compounding the disaster, crushing medical bills from his late wife's prolonged cancer battle swallowed every single dollar of savings he had managed to squirrel away. Eventually, the shop had to close its doors for good. Ever since that heartbreaking chapter, he had survived on a patchwork of temporary gigs: warehouse night shifts, freelance furniture assembly, anything and everything that could put a modest meal on the table for him and Emma. This particular interview was supposed to be the turning point, the light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. It was for a stable maintenance supervisor position that promised steady health insurance and enough financial breathing room to finally stop waking up in a cold sweat every month worrying about rent. Instead, the hiring manager had offered a polite, practiced smile and said, "I deeply appreciate your extensive experience, Mr. Brooks, but we're really looking for someone with a background in corporate management." Daniel had simply nodded quietly. He didn't bother to argue or plead his case. Life had already taught him the hard lesson that sometimes, no matter how hard you try or how good your intentions are, good people still lose. As he had stepped back into the lobby just moments earlier, another small twist of fate had unfolded right before his eyes. An elderly janitor was struggling desperately to keep a heavy cleaning cart from careening down the slippery entrance ramp. Before anyone could react, a loose bucket tipped sideways, sending a chaotic flurry of maintenance reports and paperwork scattering wildly across the pristine floor. Without a second thought, without even pausing to dwell on his own crushing disappointment, Daniel dropped to his knees. He scrambled to gather the scattered pages before the bustling foot traffic could trample them. He picked up broken mop parts and even pulled a small, trusty screwdriver from his pocket to help tighten a squeaky, loose wheel on the cart. The elderly custodian had flashed a tired, grateful smile and whispered, "Didn't get the job, son?" Daniel had offered a soft, self-deprecating laugh. "No, not quite. Yet you still stopped to help an old man," the janitor noted. Daniel just shrugged gently. Well, someone had to. Neither man had any idea they were being watched from the second-floor mezzanine. Margaret Lawson rarely sat in on routine interviews, preferring to trust her department managers to handle day-to-day hiring. But today, purely by chance, she had been walking down the glass-paneled hallway overlooking the grand lobby below. She hadn't heard a single word of their conversation, but she had witnessed the aftermath of rejection. Most applicants stormed out of the building fuming. Some muttered complaints under their breath, and others outright blamed the company for their misfortune. This particular man, however, had chosen to help a struggling stranger instead. She kept walking, her mind occupied with corporate matters, yet something about the quiet dignity of that stranger lingered persistently in the back of her thoughts. Out on the sidewalk, dark, ominous storm clouds were rolling over the downtown skyline. Daniel pulled out his phone to check the time and saw a missed call notification accompanied by a voicemail alert from Emma's elementary school. A cold knot twisted tightly in his stomach. He dialed back instantly. "Mr. Brooks?" The school nurse's voice came through, gentle but urgent. "Emma experienced a mild asthma attack during recess. She's completely fine now, but she's quite shaken and asking for you." Daniel whipped his head around, looking frantically between the nearby bus stop and the imposing facade of the corporate building behind him. He checked his wallet. He had exactly $23 to his name. Taking a taxi home would practically wipe out his grocery money for the week. Turning his back, he broke into a desperate run toward the subway station. Back inside the building, completely unseen behind the tinted glass entrance, Margaret Lawson had just walked into the HR department and posed a single, pointed question. "Did that last applicant leave yet?" The HR director looked genuinely startled. "Yes, Ms. Lawson. Unfortunately, he simply wasn't qualified under our strict corporate requirements." Margaret frowned deeply. "Are we talking about actual job requirements? Or are we just hiding behind comfortable assumptions?" The room fell instantly silent. She held out her hand. "Bring me his interview file, please." Flipping through the papers, she saw that his resume certainly didn't look impressive by corporate standards. No fancy college degree, no high-level executive titles, noticeable employment gaps. He had been evaluated, categorized, and rejected in a brisk 12 minutes flat. But then, tucked near the back, she noticed a single, overlooked attachment, a handwritten recommendation letter from the director of a local community shelter. "Mr. Brooks voluntarily repaired our entire children's wing after a devastating pipe burst," the letter read. "He steadfastly refused any payment, insisting that the families staying here needed the money far more than he did. Another time, he spent his weekends volunteering to fix heaters for vulnerable elderly residents, never once missing a commitment despite caring full-time for his terminally ill wife." Not a single one of those profound achievements had ever surfaced during the interview, simply because nobody had bothered to ask the right questions. Margaret slowly closed the thick folder, her expression resolute. Find him. By the time Daniel reached the school, he was completely out of breath. He found Emma sitting quietly in the nurse's office, wrapped snugly in a warm blanket. "I'm okay, Daddy," she whispered, her eyes wide. "You ran all the way here?" Despite being soaked in sweat through his shirt, he offered her a reassuring, loving smile. "I've run much farther than this for you, sweetie." Emma reached slowly into her backpack and pulled out a fresh piece of paper. "I made another note for you." She handed him a tiny, colorful drawing depicting a grinning man wearing a bright yellow construction helmet. Across the top, she had scrawled in uneven, heartfelt letters. "You don't lose until you stop trying." Daniel swallowed hard, a sudden lump catching in his throat as his eyes stung with unshed tears. Right at that exact second, his phone vibrated in his hand, an unknown number flashing on the screen. He almost swiped to ignore it, thinking it was just another telemarketer, but answered anyway. "Mr. Brooks. Speaking. This is Margaret Lawson." Daniel furrowed his brow, frantically searching his memory. "I'm sorry, I don't quite. I am the CEO at Lawson Structural," she explained. her voice slightly breathless, as if she had been moving quickly. "I know this must sound entirely unusual, but could you possibly come back to the office?" He glanced down at Emma, then looked at the nearly depleted subway card in his palm. "I honestly don't think another interview is going to change the outcome, ma'am." "This isn't another interview." Margaret paused, letting out a soft sigh. "I think we simply asked all the wrong questions the first time around." An hour later, when Daniel stepped back into the corporate headquarters, he braced himself for another intimidating conference room with stark white walls. Instead, Margaret personally led him deep into the bustling maintenance workshops, introducing him not to suits and board members, but to the actual heartbeat of the company. Welders, electricians, mechanics, and painters. She watched closely as Daniel greeted each working-class employee with genuine warmth and respect. Within minutes of walking through the shop, Daniel naturally spotted a misaligned loading dock door that had clearly been frustrating the warehouse crew for weeks. Without any hesitation, he crouched down, inspected the stubborn hinge, and quietly explained the mechanical reason why it kept catching and sticking. Nobody had asked him to troubleshoot it. It was just second nature to him. One veteran mechanic grinned broadly and nodded. "He's spot on." Margaret didn't say a word, choosing to silently observe his effortless rapport. Then, another minor crisis unfolded right before them. A young apprentice accidentally fumbled an expensive, delicate laser measuring tool, sending it clattering against the concrete floor. The poor kid looked utterly terrified, convinced he was about to be fired on the spot. Daniel calmly picked up the device, inspecting it for damage. Instead of scolding or criticizing the young man, Daniel smiled warmly and shared a story about how he had once completely botched an entire custom cabinetry order by rushing through the finishing process. "The real mistake isn't dropping a tool," Daniel said gently, his voice soothing the boy's panic. "The mistake is pretending it didn't happen and trying to hide it." The apprentice immediately confessed to his supervisor before anyone else could even point fingers. Watching the scene unfold, Margaret could literally see the palpable wave of relief wash over the entire workshop floor. A culture built on mutual trust rather than paralyzing fear. Later that afternoon, the two of them finally sat down together in a quiet office. "No one actually failed today, Daniel," Margaret said softly. Daniel looked completely baffled. "Respectfully, Ms. Lawson, I did. I was shown the door in 12 minutes. "No," she corrected, leaning forward. "You failed an interview that was mechanically designed to measure leadership solely through corporate paperwork and buzzwords." She slid a brand new, thick folder across the table toward him. "Our maintenance division currently suffers from the highest employee turnover rate in the entire company." Daniel listened intently, his attention completely captured. "We don't need another rigid manager who just pushes papers around," Margaret continued with a faint smile. "What we desperately need is someone that people will naturally respect, trust, and follow." Daniel stared at her in stunned silence, processing the weight of her words. "I can't promise that this job is going to be easy. I've never wanted easy things in life," Margaret added candidly. "And I certainly can't offer you the inflated corporate salary you initially asked for." Daniel's heart sank for a split second, but she quickly pressed on. "Because the position I'm offering you is entirely different." She slid a fresh employment contract across the polished wood surface. The title typed at the top read, Director of Facilities Culture and Operations. Along with it came a remarkably generous salary, full health coverage, and flexible working hours explicitly structured so he could properly care for his daughter. Daniel blinked rapidly several times, struggling to find his voice. Why me?" Margaret looked at him with absolute sincerity. "Because after being told a definitive no, and walking away empty-handed, You still chose to show me exactly who you are and the kind of person you decide to be when nobody is watching. 6 months later, a remarkable transformation had taken root across the entire company. Employee turnover within the maintenance and facilities division plummeted by nearly half. It wasn't because of harsher policies or stricter corporate rulebooks, but simply because Daniel made the effort to learn every single worker's name. He spent his breaks building sturdy new wooden benches so the grueling labor crew had a comfortable, proper place to sit and eat their lunches together. He took younger apprentices under his wing, patiently mentoring the ones who reminded him of his own struggling younger days. He even successfully lobbied upper management to institute an emergency family leave policy for hourly workers, drawing directly from his own painful experiences caring for his late wife. One quiet evening, as the rest of the corporate staff headed home for the day, Daniel spotted the elderly janitor from his interview day visiting the building lobby to drop off some paperwork. The older man flashed a wide, knowing grin. "Looks like somebody finally noticed the good work around here." "Eh?" Daniel chuckled warmly. "I guess they finally noticed you, too." In reality, Daniel had quietly championed the janitor for a permanent facilities advisor role months prior, ensuring his steady employment and well-deserved respect. The circle of quiet kindness had finally come completely around. Years later, when Emma grew older, she would recount this pivotal chapter of their lives quite differently to anyone who asked. She never mentioned the initial rejection letter. She never talked about the stiff corporate interview. Instead, she would always beam with a proud smile and say, "My dad got his dream job simply because he stopped to help a stranger when he thought nobody was watching." And perhaps, when all was said and done, that truly was the only real interview that ever mattered. After all, resumes can neatly list technical skills, and standard interviews can measure a person's surface-level confidence. But true character rarely shows itself in the spotlight. It only reveals its true colors in the quiet moments right after disappointment. The world around us rarely changes because of the loudest or strongest people in the room. Far more often, it transforms simply because someone chooses to extend kindness, even when they firmly believe that no one is watching.